Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, you're listening to another episode of Divergent Conversations. I'm your co host, Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And today we are going to talk about traveling and our neurodiverse experiences while traveling. I just got back from 30 days in Europe and work retreat mode. And I know you and I were talking on Instagram a lot about
Mhm.
what the experience was like and how I was showing up and impacted. And it was a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because from the Instagram messaging we were doing, I could tell like the drain that you were experiencing over there. And I'd love to hear more like in person, well, in Zoom person, what your experience was of traveling. I know you love traveling and we've talked about that before, but I also got the sense that this trip, I don't know, was this trip different for you?
It was really testing, for a lot of reasons, like 30 days abroad,
Yeah.
away from home, away from my partner and my dogs and my bed.
Huh.
But like those things I think would be challenging for anybody in a lot of ways. I think the things that were like really evident for me and really challenging for me was one I was traveling with a friend and business partner, so like I did
Oh, the whole
feel like
time?
yeah, the whole 30 days. So I
My
felt like
daughter and I
a
were
lot.
just talking about this, about how, like, being alone versus being with someone else you're tracking makes a world of difference. I thought you were alone. I didn't realize you were with someone.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what came up when you and your daughter were talking about this, because I'm sure it's very relatable and similar to what I was
Um,
experiencing.
yeah, I mean, it was interesting. They had, my husband had taken them to Olive Garden, which is their, like, favorite restaurant, and I typically don't go, and it was kind of a sweet moment. My daughter had just had a meltdown and was having a lot of kind of, shame around that, and I was, like, reminding her, like, this is your body having a response. This is outside of your control. So we were talking about, and she was asking me about like meltdowns. So I was like, I have more shutdowns, and I was like, that's like why I didn't go to the restaurant with you all, and because I know I would just be kind of like I wouldn't be there. And so we are talking about meltdown shutdowns, and then we were talking about what it's how she's like, yeah, I noticed it's easier for me to be in public or to be like it's she's like, that's what I liked when I wasn't in person schools. I only had to track myself. I wasn't tracking like what my brother was doing or you or dad. And I was just relating to that. I'm like, yeah, like I really so much easier for me to travel alone, to go to a coffee shop alone, just to be in the world alone. When I'm tracking my children, when I'm tracking my dog, when I'm tracking my spouse, it's too much.
Yeah. And it's multifaceted, right? Like that's very layered. Like there's a
Mhm.
tracking, I imagine, as a parent where it's like, this is kind of my responsibility to track. And then
Mhm.
there's like the tracking that goes on when we're constantly tracking body language and
Uh-huh.
absorbing energy and just responding to and kind of almost like anticipating and trying to attune and trying to be connected and trying to respond appropriately and all the things that go into relational dynamics.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it was it was so hard in so many ways, but I think I anticipated that. Like I knew going in, like, this is not going to be an easy 30 days. Like, for most people on the
Mhm.
outside looking in, if you're saying, like, oh, I'm traveling from Greece to Italy to Spain to Portugal, people are like, that's fucking amazing. And I don't want to discount that either because there were amazing moments. But man, it was just constant tracking and energy absorption and overwhelm. And you're talking like planes, trains, automobile
Yeah.
situation where you're living out of
Uh-huh.
a suitcase, you can't get settled.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
a ton of transitions you did in 30 days.
yeah, we stayed in 10 different rentals in that 30-day
Ooh.
period in 4 different countries. So
Is that how
and
you typically travel?
No, this was very specific because we were we were there to host a retreat in Spain at the end of April, but we were also there to find venues for 2024 retreat
Mhm.
destinations. So we were meeting with like hotel managers and venue hosts and
Oh, so you were
tour
peopling
guides and
as well.
peopling all the time. So it was
My
like
gosh.
going on tours to not only like highlight this is what we're going to do when all of you come
Mhm.
here next year, but also to meet people and build connections. And so it was constant. And
Mhm.
I found myself I found myself significantly more quiet than I usually am, and I'm
Mhm.
usually quiet in general. And then feeling really disconnected and also just like really having to be very intentional about energy. So there were days where I was like, I'm not peopling today. And I would tell my friend, I can't commit to what we're going to do tomorrow. I'm just going to stay in
Yeah.
the Airbnb. Um, there was a night at the retreat in Spain where I was just over it. Like we had gone to Barcelona. There's a group of 32 of us, and I was very often like the one who was like tracking, but also
Yeah.
for safety purposes, like
Yeah.
making sure we have our group, making sure everyone's together, like all the things. And I'm very, very crowded, overstimulating city in Barcelona with people everywhere. And, I just was like, I got back to the venue that night and they were getting ready for dinner. And I was like, I'm going back to our Airbnb. Like, I'm just going to walk down the hill, go into my room, watch Netflix, like not do this thing. And thankfully having the ability to do that was an option, but holy shit, a lot.
Yeah, that like, I feel kind of overwhelmed just hearing about all you're doing. I know I knew you were looking at retreat sites, but I guess I didn't think through kind of the logistics of how much transitions and peopling and, yeah, that wasn't really a vacation, huh?
No, not at all. I don't think we had many restorative, like relaxing days. And it's a matter of like being on the go, then having to attend to someone else and attune to someone else and track someone else when
Mhm.
I wanted to just be alone and just be like, I don't want to talk to
Yeah.
anybody.
Yeah.
Um, and I will say my friend and business partner did a great job of acknowledging like I can tell this is where your energy is, and
Yeah.
I'm not
Good.
gonna push that, and that was helpful. Um, but there were definitely days where I was rendered pretty like unable to do anything besides get out of bed and like eat and take
Mhm.
care of my basic needs. And for me, I think that brings up a lot of shamefulness still to this day where I'm like,
Mhm.
why can't I push through this? And it's really
Yeah.
not to push through. It's like
Yeah.
you're overstimulated and you need to really ground and regulate. And I think
Mhm.
that for me still brings up some psychological and emotional like um thought processes and experiences where I'm like, why can't you just fucking do this? Like,
Yeah.
why can't you get up and go have this good time with this group? And I'm like, I can't do it. There's no way I can do that. And
Mm.
asking for what you need in these moments is crucial, but I know it's also challenging for a lot of people to
Mhm.
do as well.
That experience right there, that moment of like, why can't you just push through this and like go enjoy this group? I feel like now I understand it, but before I know I was autistic, I would have that experience so much. It's what I called years ago with my therapist before I knew I was autistic, the plexiglass of like, I cannot get into my experience. And I'd be in these, whether I was at a family gathering or especially like an extended family vacation or a social gathering or a group dinner, like I would be sitting there in my head being like, get into this experience, get into it, get into it, get into it, and unable to. And I'd have so much confusion around why I kind of get into my experience, so much shame around it. I would start like doubting kind of my key relationships of, does this mean there's something wrong with my relationship that I can't be in this experience? But that to me, that kind of when the body puts the brakes on and it's like, no, like you're staying in bed today, or like you just can't go do that group thing, like you were talking about that experience in that hotel. To me, that is like one of those grief moments when I talk about grieving my autism. Like that is a moment where I grieve being autistic. That's those are fucking painful.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really fucking painful. And because in and in your moments, like your body is then saying like having that like finally, like, this is what I needed. But your brain is not saying that to you when you're laying in
Mhm.
bed and trying to like recover. What my brain is saying is like, how can you trick your body into continuing to push
Yeah.
through, even
Yeah.
though you don't have anything left,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yep.
And
How
I
can
think
you
that's
bypass this thing your body's doing? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, how can I do these like mental gymnastics of like,
Mhm.
oh, it's okay because you're gonna like fuel up on caffeine or like you're gonna like numb
Mhm.
out on alcohol, and that's how
Yeah.
you're gonna
The
feel
2 options. Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
And,
Yeah.
I definitely paid attention to that throughout the 30 days. Like, well, you drank a lot in 30 days. And I thought, if I didn't in those moments, like, it would have felt so overwhelmingly
Mhm.
unbearable to
Mhm.
feel that constant buzz of like anxiety and tension and like constant
Mhm.
overwhelm that it was
Yeah.
almost necessity. And I know we're going to have to do an episode on substance use at some point, but
I was literally just thinking that. I was like, we've got to talk about alcohol.
yeah, but it was challenging. And, as someone who hosts these events, I will find myself defaulting to like movement, which is like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
cleaning up after 30 people, like
Oh my
constant
gosh. Yeah, that is always
movement,
my partly it gives you a
always.
role.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's allowing you to like just be in motion, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
and not having to talk or process
Uh-huh.
anything else that's happening. So
Yeah.
which further creates exhaustion and exacerbation in your body because your body's like,
Mhm.
and what I was noticing, and I wanted to message you this while I was noticing it, was like everything was intensified, right? So like the
Mhm.
throbbing of your feet is intensified, the
Mm.
pain in your back is intensified,
Mhm.
your frustration tolerance and irritability are
Mhm. I
massively
said.
intensified. Everything's heightened. And
Mhm.
my friend said it to me one day, like one of our last days in Portugal, when I was describing like how torturous this experience feels like because she's neurotypical and she's like waking up bubbly every day. And I'm like, how the fuck do people do this? First of all. Um, and she was like, it sounds like your experience in life is like a open nerve ending that is
Yeah.
just being like shocked all the
Yeah.
time by everything.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, yeah, that feels pretty freaking accurate.
That's so interesting. So I again, before I had the autism lens, the way I used to describe my daughter was as if her nervous system was on the outside of her skin,
Hmm.
like just a live wire of nerves. And there is something that so viscerally captures the autistic experience with that idea of an open nerve. Um, yeah, that feels really relatable.
Yeah, and I think like once you're able to like relate to that and kind of create that picture for somebody else who doesn't get it, it
Hmm.
offers a lot of like insight into what day to day is. But I think again, circling back to what you said about that grief, is that creates an enormous amount of grief because
Yeah.
there's no protective like armor that you're putting on and when you have to go out
Mm-mm.
into the world. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things where in that moment when you're like, yeah, that does describe my experience. That is how it feels. But then
Hmm.
my brain's like, what is the alternative?
My life.
My life. Yeah.
I rarely leave my house. Yeah. No, it, yeah, I mean, I could get emotional talking about this. Like, it does feel like the decision is to have a really small life or to lean into experiences, but to be constantly confronted with the too muchness of the world. I don't like either option, but that's kind of what we have.
I can feel like emotion for you knowing that our worlds are vastly different in terms of how we're
Mm.
experiencing them.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's gotta there's no middle ground here. Is there? Is there like I don't know who's found it. I
I,
would like to know.
yeah, and I guess now my like I don't know if it's guilt or my protective instincts are coming in of like, I'm sure there's a middle ground. And I'm sure that's my all or nothing thinking saying like, we've got two terrible options here. I think there is. I think nature actually provides a middle ground. Like the one place I can go outside my home and feel restored, is nature. So whether that's, and I'm in Oregon. So whether that's the coast or I live near forest. So going on walks in the forest, and it not only doesn't take, I mean, it's the one place I can go out in the world and it recharges me. And so I think nature and green space can be that sort of in between space. Or like for me, I can't really do restaurants, but if I'm eating outside at a restaurant, um, that that works. So the outdoors, I really live in the wrong state. I mean, it rains like 6 months out of the year here. I always ever since we got married, I've been asking my spouse, like, can we move to California? I need some sunshine.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's a good point. Like nature is a good middle ground, such a good regulatory place for people and grounding space. I think that's what was challenging is like big city followed by train slash plane
Mhm.
slash chaos of airport or train station. And then like having to show up and do the agenda or the itinerary or meet with the tour guide or this person. And like, one, I hate being boxed in by fucking scheduling. And that just creates even more immense pressure, I think. But ultimately, it also is just so tiring, like for any human being. But it was just unbelievably overstimulating. And I
Mm.
just felt so overwhelmed throughout those 30 days. And before I left, I told my therapist, I said, I know these 30 days are going to be really fucking hard. And here's what I would like my goal to be is that I would like to go into it knowing that most days are going to be a challenge. But I would also like to somehow be able to acknowledge the little things like the beautiful
Mm,
scenery
mhm.
that I get to
Yeah,
see and the good food and the good conversations that come up with random people that I
yeah,
meet. I'd like
yeah.
to be able to have both exist and be true. And I do
Mhm.
think that was captured because although I would say the extent of the 30 days was unbelievably overwhelming, and I don't think I could ever put myself through another 30 days like that, I there were good moments too.
Mhm.
Like, there are
Mhm.
definitely moments that I can anchor into and
Yeah.
remember, and I think that's the way that I can get through those
Mhm.
experiences is to
Yeah,
acknowledge like, all
yeah.
right, today sucked, but one glimpse of like positivity and solid connection and food that was good or like beautiful stuff. And I think that was helpful for me for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that ability to hold the both and to intentionally be, like, bringing to mind the sensory pleasurable moments and the delight. Yeah, yeah.
Such a
And
therapist way of thinking too, like all
it really is, yeah. Yeah. I'm doing, in a couple of months, my workbook's on gratitude, so I've been diving into the gratitude research, and it's been a good reminder of, like, yeah, like, it's really what we're priming our brains to see, like, we will see, and, um, the power of that. I am kind of diverging. I guess our podcast is literally called Divergent Conversation, so I guess I don't need to ask permission for that. Um, but this idea of gratitude and sensory overload, also in processing as I'm talking, this doesn't always go well. But I think that's part of what makes travel for me a more okay sensory experience is it feels like it's selective sensory overload. Like I know I'm opting into that. Um, and I know why I'm doing it. And it's because of the value of like having a new experience and engaging with other cultures. Like these are such high values for me that I've somehow psychologically prepared for the sensory overload. And so then when it happens, it feels like I have like a sturdiness psychologically to hold that. Like if I go to the grocery store and I get sensory overloaded, the narrative that starts running is like, damn it, I can't even go to the grocery store. Like and then it starts running this narrative of like the shame and the grief and the like throwing myself a pity party for how limited my body is. But if I get sensory overloaded when I'm, in Germany with my son having an awesome experience, it's like, yeah, I signed up for this. I chose this. So there's a more empowering narrative that comes online around it. And my travel experience last summer was a really powerful realization of, I mean, sensory overload is sensory overload, but also, and also, the narrative we tell ourselves about that sensory overload impacts our experience of that sensory overload. And that was a really powerful discovery for me after Germany of like, okay, I can handle this more than I thought I could. Um, and just, I can't, I mean, yeah, I can use accommodations and there's some things I can do to manage sensory overload, but there's a lot of that that's outside of my control. But I can have some influence over the story I'm telling about the experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that feels somewhat freeing in a way to know like there is the ability to almost train your brain or at least prepare your brain and
Hmm.
strengthen to say like I acknowledge that this is going to be overwhelming, but the payoff is
Hmm.
worth it in a lot of ways too.
Hmm.
And I think that's what travel is for so many of us, like this romanticized idea of like what life can be like. But then also it is like new sights, new scenery, new smells, new sounds, new people. And that stuff is on the positive end of the spectrum for me in terms of stimulation, opposed to the
Hmm.
opposite side where it's like everything is just too much all the time. But you're right. If I go to the grocery store, it's a fucking nightmare for me. So like
Yeah, it's like the mustard was not worth that, or whatever.
exactly. So, I mean, so being able to select, and you and I have talked about time and energy and how important these things are, and maybe that's a big part of it too. Is just the acknowledgement of the intentionality behind the
Hmm.
the planning and the trip, and knowing that yeah, it's going to be overwhelming, but here's what's important to me in life, and I know that if I'm going to spend X amount of energy, I'd rather do it doing that
Hmm.
than leaving my
Hmm.
house to run errands or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That kind of selective and value based choice around, and that's again where like the conversation of privilege comes back in, right? If um you and I both have the privilege of being able to work from home, so for people, some people are using all their sensory spoons on work, and that's it, and then they're coming home, they're crashing, they're waking up doing it. That's before I was working from home. All my sensory spoons was going to work because and I was like going into deficit. Um so it's also like not always a choice for people. It's
Sure.
all going toward survival.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a great point to make and just to remember as well and reframe. Yeah. It's an interesting topic. Like I've actually but I use the platform in a lot of ways. Like one of my talks was on neurodiversity at our retreat, and that was really powerful to
Mm,
have 30 people sit there and like experience that. Not only those who don't know me or who do, but like people's spouses who came on the event and like sat
yeah.
in on the talks. I thought that was really fucking cool. So those things energize me. So I was trying to like, okay, if your battery is at 28%, how can you give X amount of that to this talk and then crash afterwards? So I was trying to give
Hmm.
myself permission to like, and I would say that in my talk too. Like after I done today, I'm done. And another thing I noticed for myself is task switching is so challenging. Like the end 3 days of this trip, we went from Spain to Portugal and the retreat was over. And I noticed as soon as the retreat was over, I was like, I'm done. Like, why am I
Uh-huh.
not
Yeah.
home? Why am I continuing on this fucking trip? Um, and I just realized, like, okay, in preparation next time, once the event is over, everything's got to come to an end because in
Hmm.
my mind, everything is now finalized and wrapped
Yeah.
up. And
Yeah.
now I'm trying to convince myself, like, to be able to get through the next 3 days in a
Mhm.
new country. So it was a very interesting experience. And I met some people along the way. Like I was on a food tour one night in Spain, and this woman. It was just my friend and two other people. That seemed to be the gist. Every time we went on a tour, it was just either my friend and I, or one or two other people. Must have been shoulder season. But after 2 or 3 hours, she looked at me and we were like walking across this bridge. It was like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and she's like, "Are you autistic?" And I was like, "Hmm, strange question,
Wow.
but ballsy." And I was like,
Mhm.
"Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, my daughter is too." And I just noticed a lot of similarities here, and then wanted to pick my brain about a million things about how I could help her
Oh.
daughter. But I thought that was very cool
Yeah.
because like I am trying to do everything in my power to support her and have a relationship with
Mhm.
her. And, I don't know what to do. And it was
Mm.
just, I
Wow.
think it felt like a great moment of connection to just
Mhm.
be able to be
Yeah.
transparent and vulnerable, and also offer some guidance as well, and some
Yeah.
some feedback and support.
This happens to you. That happened at the parade. Well, I think you maybe self-disclosed at the parade with the kid who is I think autistic ADHD. Um, that's a really interesting so the idea of like um being visibly autistic. Devin Price talks about that in his book a lot as like that's a form of self-advocacy. Um I I guess I've made some assumptions of where I wouldn't think you would be visibly autistic to where a stranger on a train would be asking, are you autistic? That's really interesting to me. Do you think you present like what am I trying to ask? I guess I'm trying to ask, yeah, like, do you feel like you present visibly autistic? What's that experience like for you?
I think that when I'm not in the mood to do something, I probably present pretty visibly autistic.
Mhm.
Uh, and that
Like
was
through
one
stimming or through like in what?
stimming, very short answers, not making eye
Oh,
contact when I respond to things,
yeah.
really not, and I'm very like, when I don't want to be somewhere, it's pretty well known that, like, in
Hmm.
my body language and my facial expressions, and
Mhm.
probably affect gets flatter. And
Mhm.
but I didn't want to be there at that food tour that night.
Yeah.
I was exhausted, and I was like, I don't want to fucking go.
Yeah.
uh I'm glad I did, but, like, yeah, I think it's one of those situations where, but I thought that was an interesting question. We were also in a small group all night, so there was some, like, conversation going on, and there was some socializing going on too. So, but
Mhm.
it was just very interesting to me to be, like, out of the blue as you're, like, finishing up and
Mhm.
wrapping up, like, "Oh, by the way, is this a thing?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Huh,
Yeah.
okay, yeah."
Yeah.
But,
I
what's interesting, if we would have had that conversation earlier in the night, I would have been all into the experience. Like, I would have been, like,
yeah.
way less removed from it, instead of just,
Uh-huh.
"I'm just here. I don't wanna fucking do this."
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay, that's in I feel like in public, I'm the same way, short answers, like yeah, flat affect. I think it just gets coded as like for women as like bitchiness or mean or
For sure.
standoffish, which then again, she had an intimate knowledge of autism because of her kid.
Yeah.
Um, that's really interesting. So there's someone, my son just switched to at home learning, but he was going to school before that. And there's a parent who I'd often see at drop off and pick up. And I was like, okay, I can tell they're autistic. And I thought about like, do I go up and ask them and like make this connection? But then I was like, but what if will they experience that as defensive? Like it was this really interesting moment of like when I can kind of tell someone's autistic and I want to make that connection, but then I have no idea how they are a, if they're aware they're
Right.
autistic, B, where they are in their process of like integrating that as an affirming part of their identity. Um, so it's always an interesting experience of also not just being visible, but then also when you're kind of tracking other people who are visibly autistic and then whether or not to ask or yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that once you have a very good understanding of yourself and what to look for in people, it becomes much more apparent in a lot of relationships. And I feel the same way, where I'm like, "Ooh, do I wanna have this conversation?" But I usually opt not to until someone brings it up. But, like, at the retreat even, I was paying attention to people around me, like, because I was like,
Mhm.
"Hey, I have a sense that some of these folks are probably not aware that they're either autistic or ADHD or autistic
Mhm.
ADHD." And I was just paying attention to their social interactions and their, uh, body language and how they were moving through the experience. And then some of them came up to me afterwards and self-disclosed and was like,
Mhm.
"Thank you so much for just talking about this openly all the time, because I can't do
Yeah.
that."
Yeah.
And I think that, hopefully that's a goal of this podcast for us, for people, is just to be able to talk about it more openly together.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I get that's probably one of the top themes of in like DMs or emails is people, especially people in our profession, the mental health profession, who are autistic or ADHD, but where it wouldn't be like financially safe or career safe to be out. Their like number one thing is like, thank you for being visible, which honestly, I don't know how much, like, I think it was a combination of like privilege and naivety and impulsivity that I like just came out as autistic and yeah, changed my life around. But yeah.
I think it's it it is a privileged place to be able to openly talk about it all the time, but I'm glad that it is impactful too, because I know at one point we're going to have a different conversation on the podcast about stuff you and I have been DMing about, and in terms of self-diagnosis and social media influence on
Mhm.
diagnosis too. And it is something to think about too, about like being openly outed and on social media, and doing that in a way where you don't have a lot of control over the narrative either.
What do you mean by that?
So if you're putting it out to the world, like, I applaud you and 100%, but you don't always have control over the impact or the fallout that that can cause from
Oh,
people as well, like family, friends, colleagues.
mm, okay.
You know, um, Unfortunately, there can be a lot of trauma that is inflicted too. So it's just a challenge
Mhm.
to figure out like when is the right time, and is there a right time for everybody. And I think it's important to have these conversations.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, absolutely. I kind of tend to caution people post diagnosis discovery, like sit with it
Yep.
before you kind of start disclosing.
Yeah, because I think there's such a desire to like claim, right, and
Mhm.
identify, and I think it's really powerful and empowering. But I think there can be ramifications on that you're not looking for, unfortunately. And
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you've got to have like, um, you've got to have the confidence in the diagnosis to withstand all the people in the life that will often say like, no, you're not. And then compare you to like their 7-year-old white nephew. Um,
yep,
so that's one. And then you've got to have like energy spoons to educate people as you disclose. So that there's so much, yeah. And then the like unexpected fallout. Um, Sometimes it's really beautiful. Like sometimes there's that ripple effect of like many people in the family system then get identified or diagnosed. And it's this like beautiful new lens that brings people together. But yeah, sometimes it goes really sideways and becomes this divisive thing.
well, that's good foreshadowing for a future episode.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
don't know why my brain diverged there, but it's that's on my mind as well. And I think that it's just something I feel good about right now in terms of being able to have spoken about that and have private and side conversations with some people over the last couple weeks. And it's been cool because I mean, it's just great to see more and more people talking about neurodiversity in general. And it feels good that there seems to be a really proactive advocacy movement right now.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I started in this space almost 2 years ago and like, oh my gosh, in the last 2 years, a lot has happened.
You're a big part of that too.
It's weird. I don't like see myself that way. Like I think I somehow objectively know that's probably true, but like I don't experience it that way or I don't know. It's weird.
Well, we're in that awkward transition time. So
Yeah. Is it our time to do our awkward goodbye?
yeah, I think it's time to do our awkward goodbye. And, I think also just really excited to be releasing on Friday. Not that anyone who
Oh
listens to
yeah.
this episode is going to know that, but
But yeah, but this Friday we'll be releasing episode 1 and 2 and then yeah. Are oh wait, okay. Before we leave, I'm actually curious, like how are you feeling about us releasing? Can we talk about that here?
yeah, for sure. Especially nobody's going to hear this for weeks anyway.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's why I think it'll be kind of interesting actually.
I think it's, I already have a podcast that has a following, but this is a different type of podcast, like
Mhm.
the other one is much more entrepreneurial and focused on like mindset stuff. And the episodes that I've done with you or with other neurodivergent entrepreneurs have always been hits and I've enjoyed them quite a bit. But I think there's a added layer here of vulnerability and
Yeah.
intimacy and way of like, this is a topic that is our reality, right? Like, and
Mhm.
I also think
Mhm.
I also acknowledge the fact that these types of conversations are going to be really impactful and emotional for a lot of people who listen.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think that feels like some layer of responsibility there in a way of like
Mhm.
how we show up. I don't know. I think I feel like it's complicated, but I'm excited
Yeah.
for it to get out there and I've enjoyed our process for figuring out how to best do this together and how to navigate timing and scheduling and
Mhm.
trips and just trying to stay in a rhythm together and just doing and honoring what we both need when we don't feel up for it. Like I think it's been a cool experience so far.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I'm really excited about this project. I think when we were starting about talking it, a lot of words started talking about doing it. I was really intentional of like, I want to move beyond education, which I should probably think about. Like, do I actually have the luxury of doing that as someone who's a psychologist? But anyway, back to intent. I was very aware, like on Instagram and my website, it's pretty educational, and I'm not doing a lot of reflection of my experience as being autistic. So I think you mentioned this in the DMs of like it feels kind of like a vulnerable thing to put out there, and it'll be yeah. I mean, I guess that will be interesting. Of depending on like for example, when I say that there's moments I grieve my autism, I imagine that some people will really um I think for some people to give them permission. I think for some people that will make it sound like I'm not neurodivergent affirming. And so I think that would be a hard like if my experience becomes a pain point in the autistic community, I think that will be harder because I'm talking about my experience versus myself as an expert. And I think that's muddy, right? Because we sometimes I am bringing in research and I'm talking from an expertise. Sometimes I'm talking from my experience. And we're going to get feedback on all of that. And I think that's going to feel really vulnerable. And I will probably not read a lot of the comments for that reason or like ask you or like my VA to kind of filter the comments because um, those things I know can kind of hijack my nervous system when there's a wave of stuff around that.
For sure. Well,
So excitement and vulnerability.
yeah, it sounds like we're in the right place then.
Yeah.
Excitement and vulnerability. So hopefully when we circle back after this episode's released, we have more to say about that. But I agree 100%. And I've got your back in that. And I know that we can rely on the people that we hire and have support our businesses help with stuff like that as well. So yeah, I'm excited and I'm nervous and all the things. So
What's our awkward goodbye tagline? We like had a tagline once upon a time, a place where we like are okay with awkward goodbyes.
yeah, I think it was just like, we'll see you next week. Bye. So
I love the directness of that.
yep. So everyone who's listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast on all major platforms out every single Friday. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.